A, help the jurors to situate the narrative within a specific place and on a specific occasion familiar to them. The speaker concludes this detailed narrative of the crime with a strikingly visual episode that sets up a parallel between the jurors who hear the speech and the eyewitnesses within the narrative. Even though there's no direct reference to the imagination or an invitation to see, Lysias constructs his account so that the jurors identify with the eyewitnesses they hear about and, most importantly, share in their reactions to the crime. Archippus is so injured after the two whippings that his brothers have to carry him out of Thaseus' house on a couch the next morning. The speaker emphasizes the crowd of onlookers who observe their progress. Please look at number 5 on the handout. Because he was not able to walk, the brothers carried him to the samples market on a couch and showed him to many Athenians and to also many foreigners. He was in such a state that the people who saw him not only became angry at those who had done this, but also blamed the city for not immediately and publicly punishing people who had committed offenses of this type. The speaker presents the procession as a kind of spectacle by emphasizing the seeing and showing of Archippus's bruised body. The word for they showed is epidexon, and the showing takes place at the deigma, the samples market in the Piraeus. The two words come from the same root. Epidepneumi means to make a visual demonstration, and deigma means a showing. It's the place where goods were displayed for wholesale buyers. The public display of Archippus's injuries is therefore underscored not only by the word used for the showing, but also by the place where the showing occurs. Furthermore, the speaker makes clear that there are onlookers who see the display, referring explicitly to tous idontos, the people who saw him. The sight of Archippus wounded and lying on a cot inspires these witnesses to anger against both the criminals and the polis. Those may well have been the natural emotional responses to such a display, but their role in the speech is primarily rhetorical. Lysias' speaker wants the listening audience of jurors to respond to his spoken narrative in the same way as the internal audience of viewers responds to the display of Archippus. He even goes so far as to attribute to the internal audience an opinion about the polis's sluggish enforcement of malefactors that makes more sense within the context of the trial than it does on the day of the crime. The speaker wants the jurors to channel their anger into preventing Thaseus from getting away with beating Archippus. He may also want them to feel that the anger against the polis may be directed against them if they fail to convict. It's likely that the jurors would have identified with the internal audience. We must remember that the characters in the speaker's drama were also visible in the court. The narrative begins by acknowledging this. The speaker says in number 6a on the handout, Archippus, the very man right here, who see Athenians, went to take exercise at the same palaestra, the Greek word for wrestling ground, as Thaseus, the defendant. The iota, the I, at the end of hutosi, called a deictic iota, and the qualifier of the defendant directly link the narrative and the courtroom setting. The jurors not only hear about past events, but they also see the participants before them. This was true, of course, in nearly every classical Athenian trial. This speaker, however, calls particular attention to it. Lysias' speakers use deictic iotas only for people who are present in the court, which is why I translate hutosi as this very man right here. Significantly, hutosi also appears in the first sentence of the speech, number 6b on the handout. Archippus, the very man right here, is a close friend of mine, gentlemen of the jury. So, the narrative within the speech, number 6a, and the speech itself, number 6b, both begin by calling the jurors' attention to Archippus. Hutosi acts as a bridge between the here and now of the law court and the past time of the narrative. The visual orientation of the narrative towards the here and now of the law court would encourage the jurors to associate the wounded Archippus they hear about with the Archippus they see before them, and so to identify with the internal audience that sees Archippus being carried through the deigma. Even though there's no direct request that the jurors visualize the scene they hear described, therefore, Lysias still encourages them to identify themselves with eyewitnesses in his narrative. They see the same person before them in the court that the onlookers in the day counts saw being carried on a couch. The shared experience of spectatorship creates a parallel between the jurors and the witnesses. And this parallel subtly encourages the jurors to apply their dianoiai, imaginations, and to associate themselves with the witnesses. Lysias's words presuppose this imagined identification, since he attributes an emotional response to the witnesses that he wants the jurors to experience as well. Telling a story from the perspective of internal viewers is a common technique that Greek authors used to bring forth certain emotions from their audiences. The most famous example is Thucydides' account of the Athenian defeat in the harbor of Syracuse, where the spectators on shore experience shifts in emotion during the course of the battle. Throughout the battle, Thucydides connects the emotions of the Athenians on shore to what they see. By describing the battle in the harbor as a spectacle, recounting it from the perspective of its spectators, and emphasizing what Andrew Walker calls the link between vision and the emotions, Thucydides urges his readers to adopt the spectator's viewpoint and to share in their responses. On the Glory of the Athenians, Plutarch even associates this particular passage with Thucydides' own Enargeia. Please look at number 7 on the handout. Thucydides, for example, always strives in his writing for this vividness, Enargeia, desiring eagerly to make the reader a spectator, they attain, so to speak, and to produce for those reading the startling and disturbing emotions that happened in the witnesses, tous orontas. Lysias' use of internal spectators is not nearly as complicated as Thucydides'. He doesn't narrate the entire account of Tacitus' crime from the perspective of onlookers, but, like Thucydides does for the battle in Syracuse Harbor. Nonetheless, both authors employ the same fundamental narrative technique. Spectatorship forms a link between the characters in the narrative and the actual audience, and so encourages the actual audience to imagine that they are looking along with the characters in the narrative, and so to share in their emotional response to what they see. The shared sense of spectatorship is stronger for Lysias' jurors than it is for the audience of Thucydides' history, since, as we've already recognized, the jurors actually see the participants in the narrative before them in the court. Through this discussion of Lysias, we've seen that Dionysius' description of Enargeia in his speeches is a perceptive but inadequate model for understanding how Lysias manipulates his jurors' imaginations to make them feel that they experience the events he narrates as though they are present for them. Besides highly detailed accounts, he encourages his jurors to share in the spectatorship of the characters in his narratives and to respond to what he says as though they're seeing it for themselves and not just hearing about it. So, to conclude, we've studied today 2 techniques that actual Athenian litigants used to resolve the dilemma that drove Antisthenes' Ajax to despair that he could ever convince his jurors. Instead of giving up or criticizing the system, litigants and speechwriters like Aeschines and Lysias try to turn their jurors into imaginary witnesses. In one method, exemplified by against Ctesiphon, litigants appeal directly to the jurors' visual imaginations. In the other, exemplified by against Cases, litigants encourage their jurors to apply their imaginations and identify with the spectators within the narratives. This identification is one way that jurors can come to experience the sense of spectatorship that Dionysius of Halicarnassus says he experienced as a reader of Lysias. Although not all jurors would have responded to litigants' prompting and become imagined witnesses in their favor, the ability to manipulate the imaginations of even some of the hundreds of jurors who judged an Athenian trial was a fundamental aspect of persuasion in the courts. Jurors who are led to visualize a speaker's version of past events or to experience the emotions a speaker ascribes to witnesses who were really present become the speaker's allies. Influenced by logos, their feelings and imaginations seem to confirm the arguments they hear. Therefore, especially for litigants with weak cases or no witnesses, jurors who visualize can be as effective as witnesses who see. The imagined shift from hearing to seeing that we've been investigating recalls the criticism that the politician Cleon levies against the Athenian assembly in Thucydides. He accuses them of being observers of speeches, more quick to trust what they hear than what they really see. Cleon's criticism, if accurate, is a sharp indictment of Athenian democracy. If incredulous jurors or assemblymen always fell prey to appeals to the imagination, Athens would have been a democracy in name only, since decisions would always favor the speaker, who could more ably manipulate his audience's sight. We know, however, that this was not the case. We very rarely know the outcome of Athenian trials, but it's intriguing that 3 litigants who we know lost their cases all employ appeals to the juror's visual imagination. Aeschines against Ctesiphon, Demosthenes himself in On the False Embassy, who requested his jurors join him in visualizing the destruction of Phocas, and the speaker of Lysias is against Andocides, who urges his jurors to see in their minds the defendant profaning the Eleusinian mysteries. This is a small sample, but it should at least make us consider that attempts to manipulate the imaginations of jurors may, in some cases, really be attempts to conceal weaknesses, and that perceptive jurors, exercising their judging authority as Athenian citizens, recognize them as such. Along those lines, it's worth remembering that Marcia Clark did not succeed in making her jurors into imagined eyewitnesses of Ron Goldman's murder, not least because her opponent, Johnny Cochran, made the jurors into actual witnesses of his demonstration that a bloody glove failed to fit the defendant's hand. Thank you.
Questions?
Is this a matter of judgment whether these speeches that failed on this ground, is it a historical judgment or was it an actual verdict?
So it's a fact that we know that those 3 speeches lost, which we only know by the coincidence of its being written down later on in historical sources. So we know, for instance, that Demosthenes' speech on the crown defeated Aeschines against Ctesiphon. We know that Aeschines defeated Demosthenes on the False Embassy. And we also know that Andocides defeated Lysias' client in the case on mysteries. Now, whether the visualization is a reason for them losing, who knows, right? I mean, there's any number of factors. One thing that's interesting, though, is there have been studies of the effect in modern courts of narratives which make appeals to imagination. And one thing that's been shown is they always make jurors remember the case better, apparently without fail. But if you use visual language and appeals to the imagination to vivify an argument that's not very strong to begin with, it's more likely to make you lose because it makes the jurors remember it more. And that may be something what's going on in Aeschines, since he tries to make Demosthenes guilty of Thebes' fall, but in fact, Demosthenes was in Athens and Alexander was there, right?
Hey, thanks for the talk. Could you speak more specifically to the differences and similarities between energeia, I call it dianoia, but you pronounce it dianoia.
That's fine, it's just that.
And then ekphrasis?
Uh-huh.
Because they're all like running around, but I'm not really clear on how they kind of line up.
Yeah. Nor were the Greeks.
Okay.
Ekphrasis, which we often use in modern discourse to describe scenes either in poetry or in prose that are descriptions of works of art, is used by late antique rhetorical theorists almost exactly synonymously with energeia. In fact, they're both defined the same way in some authors. So there's a tradition of the two of them being treated as similar kinds of appeals to people's imaginations to help them visualize something. Dianoia or dianoia in this context is used to refer to the reasoning capacity, right? So the nous is the mind and dia is something that happens through it. In some contexts, in some philosophical contexts, Dianoia is used with a different meaning to mean the reasoning capacity rather than the imagining capacity. But in these speeches, it appears to be used to mean imagination. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you would put Dionia and then sort of energeia and ekphrasis as like rhetorical.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so dianoia would not so much be a rhetorical technique as something within the mind which is appealed to by ekphrasis or energeia. And sometimes we also have this word diatuposis, which is also used in many cases interchangeably. And that's a very nice metaphor because that's a metaphor from stamping, right? Either stamping wax or stamping metal. So with diatuposis, an image is being stamped on the mind like a wax seal is being stamped with an impression.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting stuff. Your emphasis on presencing and rhetoric reminds me of a theorist in rhetorical studies who came to the United States in the 60s and 70s named Chaim Perlman. And in his book, The New Rhetoric, talks about presencing as a rhetorical strategy. But then in another book called The Realm of Rhetoric, talks about kind of what he wants to kind of introduce, which for him might have been an introduction, but for rhetorical studies really wasn't news. But introduce this idea of probable knowledge as the realm of rhetoric. And his model for this is the courtroom. So, and he talks about presencing significantly in reference to the courtroom as a place where probable knowledge is produced. And I'm wondering if there's something that you see within these case studies, or generally speaking, or in the Greek mind, there might be a kind of affiliation between forensic oratory and presencing in the way that there isn't an affiliation between presencing and deliberative rhetoric, epidactic or some other form of speech.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you, I mean, it's a tricky question for deliberative oratory in particular because we have so little of it. But there's a nice example that I think exemplifies it. So in Demosthenes' speech on the false embassy, he gives a visual, an appeal to his jurors' imaginations to picture focus being destroyed. He blames Aeschines for that. And Aeschines is probably getting back at him for that with this thing about thieves. But in Demosthenes' second Philippic, which is a deliberative speech, he also talks about the destruction of focus, but he doesn't describe it in visual language. And in fact, in deliberative oratory, there's nothing comparable to this type of imagining presencing. And the same is true in epidactic oratory. In fact, epidactic oratory, which is really surprising when Aristotle calls it epidactic and says that its observers are like spectators, shies away completely from visual metaphors. They're infinitely more common in forensic rhetoric, which would suggest that the kind of presencing that you're talking about worked, right, or was relevant in court cases that had to do with ways of making people feel like they have knowledge of something that in other genres it wasn't important. And another thing that may be important there has to do with the audience, right? Because even if in these court cases you have 500 people, in an Athenian performance setting, that's a very intimate audience. And in all likelihood, everyone could hear it. But if you talk about a deliberative speech on the defense, you may not have assumed that you could hold enough people's attention to use this kind of imagination-driven argument. And probably maybe the same thing in the epidactic context as well, right? In a funeral oration, how many people would have been there? And also, what would you ask them to imagine? It's a bit of Athenian self-promotion of its past, not a specific appeal to knowledge of a happening like this.
It's interesting because you know, the line that you draw, which I never thought about before, which is, you know, the structure of the trial. A successful litigant is going to try to turn the juror into an eyewitness, you know, and that kind of logic, of course, suggests presencing as a, a strategy that would be brought to the fore.
Yeah.
That's the strategy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're a person that's very committed to rhetoric as situational in a very specific sense.
Yes, I think that's true, or at least Greek rhetoric. Yeah.
Okay. So I must have missed something in your talk, because if I boil it down, so tell me what I missed. It didn't work then, it doesn't work now. So that now your exemplars, right, begin to, right, the two exemplars effectively become an argument against the specificity of context.
So I think that the important thing is not that it didn't work then, right? It's that we have 3 examples of it not working then. And those I brought in at the end. We have no reason to think that in Against Cases it didn't work. We also have no reason to think that in the 25 or other number of speeches that use this, it didn't work either. And when we think about the importance of this type of exercise in late antique rhetorical education, where one of the things that you learned was how to make an audience visualize something, it gives us every reason to believe that in rhetorical situations, in court specifically, it did work. I think what I was trying to suggest was that it worked not necessarily because jurors were being manipulated into accepting a weaker argument, but that it could heighten the effectiveness of an argument that was already strong. So that it's not a sign of the ineptness of the Athenian jurors that they always fell for this, but that it could, combined with other techniques, add to their sense of plausibility, add to the case's sense of plausibility by giving them a feeling of being present.
But the weaker case, more weak, right?
Yes, but the weaker case more weak. That's right. So it's a double-edged sword, and they may not have realized that.
So in the case of the O.J. Simpson trial, what would you turn to in order to begin to explain why it didn't work? If it's actually central to the cases having failed, then what would you turn? I'm not asking you to do the analysis. I'm asking you to give me a sense of, as a rhetorical critic, where would you go?
Well, I think for the O.J. Simpson case, which is very complicated, right, obviously, you need to go through everything that's there, right, and try to gauge the effectiveness or not of the different factors of the prosecution. The most effective way to do that would obviously be to talk to the jurors and to see what affected them in what way. If such a thing is not possible, then you're limited, I think, to comparison with similar types of cases where similar types of arguments are being made to see how they work out. That would be my sense of the way to do it, to try to get an empirical sample of the effectiveness of this type of technique, which we're obviously limited to with the Athenians. And to that extent, it seems to me that it's very interesting that it's known that these types of things do make arguments more memorable, right? And that can cut both ways.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I had a similar kind of question about how we might account for the difference. I was thinking along similar lines, thinking of students in my 1100 public speaking class who ritualistically start off their speech with close your eyes and imagine. Two man and woman, all of them failed to get me to imagine. So that seems to be the question is how do you figure out, I was trying to parse the same difference, how do you know what is the thing that they're doing when they actually do get you to imagine versus fail absolutely. Now, you had a little spot in here near the end where it seems like you were saying the people who were failing were appealing directly or vaguely to the imagination, whereas the people that were succeeding were placing the auditor in the position of a witness themselves. Is there something?
No, that wasn't a distinction I was drawing.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think the question is between